The United States of America may have emerged as an independent nation after 1776 and gained recognition in 1783, but the history of these lands extends far beyond that. Thousands of years before European settlers arrived, the first inhabitants of the American continent established themselves. While it's not entirely certain how Native Americans first came to these territories, one theory suggests that people migrated from Eurasia approximately 30,000 years ago, crossing a land bridge known as Beringia that connected Siberia to North America during the Ice Age. This migration continued until about 10,000 years ago, when rising ocean levels submerged the land bridge at the end of a glacial period. The early settlers, often referred to as Paleo-Americans, gradually spread deeper into the Americas, forming tribes and nations, and developing distinct civilizations. Among the notable cultures were the Adena, Iroquois, Coles Creek, Puebloan, and Mississippian. In a different part of what is now the United States, Hawaii's history is unique. The islands remained uninhabited until the 1st century AD, with the first settlers arriving from Polynesia between the 1st and 10th centuries. The 15th century marked the beginning of European colonization. In 1492, a Spanish expedition led by Italian explorer Christopher Columbus sailed westward, seeking a new trade route to the Far East, but instead landing in what became known as the New World. This moment ignited a wave of exploration and colonization by European powers. Spain, using islands such as Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola as bases, began to expand its American empire. France established colonies in eastern North America, the Caribbean, and small parts of South America. Meanwhile, Portugal colonized Brazil, and English settlers began arriving on the eastern seaboard of North America during the 17th century. The first successful English colony, Jamestown, was founded in Virginia in 1607, and the colonies rapidly grew thereafter, with commercial agriculture based on tobacco becoming a driving force. Each of the 13 American colonies developed its own governmental structure. Governed by officials appointed from London, these colonies relied on locally elected legislatures to impose taxes and pass laws. By the 18th century, the American colonies were flourishing due to low death rates, abundant land, and a steady influx of immigrants. Many of these immigrants were African slaves who were primarily brought in to work on tobacco and rice plantations. By the 1770s, African slaves made up roughly a fifth of the population. Despite thriving economically, the relationship between the colonies and Britain soured over time, particularly after the French and Indian War, a conflict that drained British resources. In an effort to raise funds, the British Parliament imposed the Stamp Act in 1765, which levied taxes on the colonies without their consent. This led to widespread protests under the slogan, "No taxation without representation." The conflict escalated with the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when colonists protested against a new tax on tea by dumping British tea into Boston Harbor. In response, the British imposed harsh laws, stripping Massachusetts of its self-government, which sparked further resistance across all 13 colonies. The colonies united under the First Continental Congress to coordinate their opposition to British rule. In 1775, the Second Continental Congress was formed to organize a defense against British forces, and in 1776, the colonies declared their independence, forming the United States of America. The American Revolutionary War, which lasted from 1775 to 1783, saw key victories such as the capture of a British army at Saratoga in 1777. This triumph convinced France to join forces with the United States, bringing in Spain and the Netherlands as allies. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which recognized the independence of the United States and granted the new nation more land than expected. allowing expansion westward into territories previously held by Native Americans. In 1703, President Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the United States by purchasing the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million, a deal that was initially intended only to secure New Orleans and the Mississippi River. The country continued to expand, particularly after the annexation of Texas in 1845 and the acquisition of further territory following a war with Mexico. By 1861, tensions over the issue of slavery erupted into the American Civil War. After Abraham Lincoln was elected president on a platform to prevent the spread of slavery, Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederacy. The war began in April 1861 with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. After 4 years of brutal conflict, the Union emerged victorious in 1865, and the Southern states were gradually reintegrated into the Union. The late 19th century saw a period of rapid industrialization and economic growth in the United States. However, by 1898, the U.S. found itself in conflict with Spain during the Spanish-American War. After a series of swift victories, the U.S. acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam under the Treaty of Paris. The 20th century was marked by the U.S.'s participation in global conflicts, starting with World War I. Although initially neutral, the U.S. joined the Allies in 1917 after German provocations. The economy boomed in the post-war years, but this prosperity was short-lived as the Great Depression began in 1929. The economic turmoil helped set the stage for World War II, during which the U.S. joined the Allies after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Fighting across Europe and the Pacific, the U.S. played a critical role in the defeat of the Axis powers, with the war concluding in 1945 following the dropping of atomic bombs on Japan. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, engaging in a decades-long Cold War. This conflict saw proxy wars, an arms race, and ideological battles between capitalism and communism, with the U.S. aiming to prevent the spread of communism. At home, the 1960s saw the rise of the civil rights movement, which successfully fought for the rights of African Americans and other minorities. The Cold War eventually ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, but the U.S. faced new challenges in the 21st century. The September 11, 2001 attacks led to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, while the 2008 financial crisis caused the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Despite these challenges, the U.S. has remained a global power, shaping events on the world stage. The early American colonies were a melting pot of European settlers, each bringing their own religious, social, and political practices. While the Spanish and French colonies focused on converting indigenous populations to Christianity and exploiting the natural resources of the New World, the English colonies developed a different model. The English settlers, particularly those who arrived in New England, came seeking religious freedom. Puritans, for example, established a theocratic society in Massachusetts Bay, where religious observance and strict moral codes governed daily life. Meanwhile, in the middle and southern colonies, economic motives were stronger. The fertile lands of Virginia and the Carolinas gave rise to plantations that produced tobacco, rice, and cotton for export back to England. As plantations grew, so did the need for labor, which spurred the development of the transatlantic slave trade. In terms of governance, the colonies enjoyed a degree of autonomy, largely because they were geographically distant from England. The British Parliament exercised limited oversight, which allowed colonial legislatures to gain experience in self-governance. Institutions like the Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619, became important early examples of representative government. This tradition of local governance laid the foundation for the American political system, which emphasized democracy, personal liberties, and a resistance to centralized control, principles that would later form the bedrock of the U.S. Constitution. As the 18th century progressed, Enlightenment ideas from Europe began to permeate colonial society. Philosophers like John Locke and Montesquieu advocated for individual rights, the separation of powers, and the concept of a social contract. These ideas were especially influential among the colonial elite, who were increasingly frustrated with what they saw as unjust British policies. By the time the British Parliament began imposing taxes without colonial representation, many colonists had developed a strong sense of political identity that valued self-determination and limited government. The Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to purchase a government-issued stamp for every legal document, newspaper, and pamphlet, was one of the first instances of direct taxation by Britain. This sparked widespread outrage, organized protests, boycotts, and the formation of groups like the Sons of Liberty illustrated how the colonies were coalescing into a unified political force. The Boston Massacre of 1770, in which British soldiers killed 5 colonists during a confrontation, further escalated tensions. This period of unrest culminated in the Boston Tea Party of 1773, where colonists dumped 342 chests of British tea into Boston Harbor in defiance of yet another tax. In response, the British government passed the coercive acts known as the Intolerable Acts in the colonies, which severely limited Massachusetts's autonomy. Rather than quelling resistance, these acts unified the colonies in their opposition to British rule. In 1774, the First Continental Congress convened, bringing together representatives from 12